She planned to surprise her husband with the news that she was pregnant, but instead, Ren Calloway discovered betrayal hiding behind a phone screen. One dinner, one secret contract, one decision that changed everything. She vanished for 3 years, rebuilt her life from nothing, and returned stronger than anyone expected. This story teaches us that silence can be power, and healing begins the moment you stop begging to be chosen. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more emotional journeys. Thanks for watching.
The candles were already glowing when Ren Calloway placed the last dish on their penthouse dining table. She had cooked all afternoon. There was roast chicken with herbed butter, freshly baked bread, and 2 glasses of sparkling water, because she couldn't drink alcohol anymore. Not with the news she was carrying. She rested a hand on her stomach. 8 weeks pregnant. She had taken 3 separate tests, and every one was positive. She'd practiced the words all week, rehearsing in the mirror of their 34th floor apartment as Manhattan burned orange outside the massive windows. Her plan was perfect. Beckett's keys dropped into the bowl by the door at 8:14 p.m. She heard his jacket fall. Then the familiar click of his shoes on the marble floor. She picked up the small card she'd written, with just 3 little words inside, and hid it behind her back. Then she heard his voice. It was low and warm, in a way he hadn't spoken to her for months. She walked into the hallway, and then she froze. His phone was propped against the wall charger, its screen facing her. It was a video call. A woman named Sloane Mercer filled the screen, dark hair, high cheekbones, a Cartier watch glinting in the light. But it wasn't Sloane's face that made something inside Ren crack. It was the way Beckett was laughing. So free, so easy, like a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. Or maybe just a man who hadn't been caught yet. Ren stood perfectly still. As a designer, she noticed every detail in those 11 seconds. The angle of his body, the soft way he said the word tonight, as if he was opening a door. She stepped back into the kitchen, placed the card face down on the counter, opened her laptop, and typed 3 sentences to Jasper Whitfield, the lawyer who had handled her father's estate. She hit send before she could have second thoughts. Then she walked to the home office, Beckett's private space, usually locked, but he'd gotten careless, and found the USB drive sitting right beside his keyboard. She plugged it in and started copying the files. The progress bar crawled. 2%, 18%, 67%. She pulled it out at 94%. That was good enough. By the time Beckett strolled into the kitchen, Ren was already putting on her coat. "You're going out?" he asked, looking at the untouched dinner with a frown. "Yes," she said, her voice perfectly steady. She grabbed her bag. She didn't glance at the card on the counter. She didn't touch her stomach. She walked to the elevator, pushed the button, and waited. The doors slid open. She stepped inside. On the counter, the card read, "We're going to be 3. She left it right there. The drive to Philadelphia should have taken 2 hours, but Ren did it in 90 minutes. Her mother, Carla Calloway, opened the front door before Ren even had a chance to knock. She must have heard the car on the gravel, and after one look at her daughter's face, she said nothing. She just moved aside. She just put on the tea kettle. Ren sat at the old kitchen table where she'd had done her homework as a kid, where her father, James, read the paper every Sunday, where they ate every Thanksgiving until he was too sick to even sit up. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon and old wood, exactly like it always had. She pressed both of her palms flat on the table and took a breath. "I found something," she said. On Beckett's USB drive. Carla placed 2 mugs on the table. "What kind of something?" Ren opened her laptop and pulled up the file. It was a contract from 8 years ago, scanned and buried inside 3 different folders. Her father's name was right there on the signature line. James A. Calloway, lead architect. The project was the famous Lorne Meridian Tower on 6th Avenue, the very building that had made Beckett's father, Conrad Lorne, a giant in New York real estate. And tied. The contract had a royalty clause, a fee-sharing deal for decides a number that over 8 years would be worth about 28% of the entire Lorne Meridian Group. And it had never been paid. Carla sat down heavily, her hands wrapped tight around her mug. Your father tried to collect that money for 3 years, she said. Conrad's people claimed there was a mistake in the contract. Then they just stopped taking his calls. She paused, then swallowed hard. Then the work just vanished. All of it. Every client disappeared. Your father always thought it was just a bad economy. It wasn't the economy, Ren said quietly. No, Ren stared at the screen. Her father had died 5 years ago, broke and exhausted, thinking he was a failure. He had designed the building that created an empire, and he died believing it was his own fault, that he had nothing to show for it. Carla reached across the table, touching her daughter's hand. Is there something else? Do you remember Jasper Whitfield? He called me 6 months after the funeral. He said he was holding the original signed contract, the real one with the notary stamp. He told me he was waiting for the right moment. Just then, Ren's phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she didn't know. Calloway, this is Jasper Whitfield. I know tonight was probably difficult. I have waited 8 years to hear from your family. When you're ready, I have everything. Ren read it again, then looked up at her mother. I'm pregnant, she said. Carla closed her eyes for a very long moment. When she opened them again, they were shining with tears. Well then, you have even more of a reason. Ren slowly nodded. Outside, a soft, steady rain had begun to fall against the old glass. She thought of the card on the penthouse counter. She thought of Beckett's easy laugh on that video call. She thought about her father's name on a contract that was never honored. I'm not going to file for divorce, she said, her voice low. Not yet. Carla looked at her, confused. First, I'm going to disappear, Ren said. And when I come back, I'm going to be holding all the cards. She closed the laptop, drank her tea, and started to make a plan. 3 years can change you in ways you don't expect, not in big, dramatic moments, but in all the small, quiet ones that add up until you become someone else entirely. Ren Calloway's office, on the 3rd floor of an old warehouse in Los Angeles, smelled of drafting paper, cold brew coffee, and the lavender candle she lit during long client calls. Her walls were covered with architectural blueprints and fancy certificates. She'd won 3 national design awards in just 3 years, a career path that made people in the industry wonder, where on earth did she come from? She never gave them the same answer twice. Her firm, Calloway Studio, now had 6 employees, a long waiting list, and a feature in Architectural Digest that her mom had framed for her Philadelphia kitchen. And every evening at 6:15, Ren's assistant would knock on her door to say goodnight, and Ren would close her laptop, grab her bag, and drive her plain white Toyota Camry 12 minutes to the apartment where Theo was waiting. Theo was 3 years old. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth, and his favorite thing to do was build things out of anything he could find. Cardboard, boxes, sofa cushions, wooden blocks. He stacked them with an instinct for design that made Ren's heart ache in a very complicated way. Mama, look, he said that Tuesday, pointing at a tower he'd built from old Amazon boxes. I made a building. That's a wonderful building, she said, kneeling down beside him. Tell me about it. It's really tall, he said very seriously, and nobody can knock it down. She kissed the top of his head and didn't cry. She had become very good at not crying. Later, after Theo was asleep, curled around a stuffed elephant with one arm protecting it, Ren sat on the counter, eating leftover rice and scrolling the news on her phone. A headline made her stop. Lorne Meridian Group files for New York Stock Exchange IPO with a projected $2.3 billion valuation. She read the article twice. Then she called Jasper Whitfield. He answered on the very first ring, like he was waiting. I saw it too, he said instead of hello. The contract's royalty clause, she said. How long is it good for? There was a pause. There's a 10-year window on the enforceability clause. It was standard for contracts back then. He paused again, this time more carefully. Ren, if they go public, the corporate restructuring will legally cancel out the original contract terms. Forever. She looked at the clock on her microwave. 11:47 p.m. How many days do we have? She asked. 47. She was silent for a long time. From the bedroom, she could hear Theo's soft, sleeping breaths. Book me 2 tickets to JFK, she said. I'll call you with the dates. She hung up the phone and sat in the dark. She thought of the life she had built here. She thought of everything that was stolen before. Then she opened her laptop and began to write a list. JFK Airport at 6 in the morning smells like jet fuel and regrets. And Wren had neither. She walked through arrivals with Theo on her hip and a bag over her shoulder, wearing dark jeans, a gray wool coat, and no jewelry at all. Nova was already there, leaning against a post with her arms crossed, holding 2 Starbucks cups. She had the look she always got when she'd stayed up too late and loved every minute of it. You look awful, Nova said, handing her a coffee. You look like you drove here from a different time zone. Wren shot back. Brooklyn. Same thing. Nova looked down at Theo. Hey, buddy. Theo looked at his aunt very seriously. You have red hair now. Yes, I do. Why? Because I felt like it. He considered this. Okay. He reached for her coffee cup. She let him think for a second, then pulled it away. He laughed. That was their dynamic, settled in 60 seconds flat. They took a taxi to Midtown East, not the Upper East Side, not even close. Wren had found the sublet through a colleague. It was a furnished 2-bedroom on 51st Street, paid for in cash for 3 months under the name Callaway Studio. No personal paper trail. Jasper was waiting in the apartment when they arrived. 70 years old and silver-haired, wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning, despite the hour. He shook Wren's hand, then looked at Theo. Then he looked back at Wren. He has his grandfather's eyes, Jasper said quietly. James would have loved to see him. Wren did not answer. She set Theo up with his tablet and headphones in the bedroom, then returned to the kitchen table, where Jasper had spread out all his files. The case was clean. The original contract was notarized. The royalty clause was completely airtight. James Callaway had signed it in good faith, and Conrad Lorne had buried it in bad faith. The damages, argued correctly in front of a federal judge, could force either a cash settlement or an equity transfer. There's one obstacle, Jasper said. Conrad has bought judges, Wren said. 2 in the Southern District. He slid a folder across the table. But not in the Eastern District. I have already filed a preliminary motion there. Wren nodded. What else? The timeline is tight, he paused. And Beckett's legal team is formidable. The second they know someone is challenging the IPO, they will come hard. Good, Nova said from the counter while eating an apple. We want them running. Wren looked at the table buried under documents. 3 years of patience, 47 days left. A sleeping 3-year-old in the next room. And then her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A text. Callaway, I know you are in New York. I would like to propose something mutually beneficial. Harlan. She stared at that name. Dex Harlan. Beckett's biggest rival. She had never met him. She hadn't told a single person she was in the city. She showed her phone to Nova, who raised an eyebrow. How does he know? Nova asked. That is exactly what I want to find out, Wren said. She told herself she was not going to do it. She did it anyway. La Bernardine on West 51st was 12 blocks from her sublet. She walked it in the cold, hands deep in her coat pockets, telling herself she just needed air. Telling herself this was not what it looked like. The November wind from the Hudson cut between the buildings, and she leaned into it like it was something she deserved. She stood on the opposite sidewalk. Through the restaurant's tall windows, warm light spilled gold across the wet pavement. She could see the room. White tablecloths, low candles, the quiet theater of expensive things. She found them in 4 seconds. Beckett was at a corner table. He looked the same. No, he looked better, which was somehow worse. The suit was different, darker. He had cut his hair slightly shorter. He was talking, and whatever he said made Sloane Mercer smile slowly. It was the way people smile when they are performing happiness, but getting the performance slightly wrong. Wren watched for 40 seconds. That was all. She did not feel the rage she expected. She felt something quieter and more damaging. Clarity. This man had looked for her for almost no time at all. He had filed paperwork, yes. She knew about the divorce petition, unwithdrawn after 6 months when she could not be located. He had moved on. He had built the IPO. He had lived. She walked back to the apartment. The city moved around her, indifferent and enormous. And she was grateful for it. New York did not care about her grief. It never had. That was why she had always loved it, and why she needed to leave. Theo was asleep when she got back. Nova was on the couch reading on her Kindle, her feet tucked under her, a lamp throwing a small warm circle of light. "You went, didn't you?" Nova said. It was not a question. Yes, and Ren hung up her coat and sat on the edge of the couch. "He looks fine," she said. "He looks completely fine." Nova was quiet for a moment. "You knew he would. Knowing and seeing are different." "Yeah." Nova put her Kindle down. "Did you cry yet?" "No, go ahead. And I will not say anything." Ren pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. One breath, two. The third one cracked something open she had kept sealed for a long time, and she cried quietly, carefully, for exactly 4 minutes. Then she stopped. She wiped her face and opened her MacBook Pro. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" Nova asked. "Now I am ready." She pulled up Jasper's case files. "We need to request the full Eastern District hearing schedule. I want to know exactly when we can get in front of a judge." Nova uncurled from the couch and came to look over her shoulder. "Also," Ren added, "text Dex Harlan back. Tell him I will meet him. Coffee only, public place. He picks the location, I pick the time." She did not look up from the screen. Her eyes were perfectly dry now. She had work to do. Dex Harlan was not what she had pictured. She had expected the Wall Street theatrics. Aggressive jaw, a firm handshake, the whole performance. Instead, he was sitting at a corner table at a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue, reading a worn copy of the 48 Laws of Power with a pen in his hand, making actual notes in the margins. An Americano sat half-finished beside him. He looked like a man who was always doing 2 things at once and had stopped apologizing for it. He stood when she approached. Tall, composed. Not Beckett composed, with that cold, deliberate stillness, but a comfortable kind of composed, like someone who decided a long time ago that urgency was a choice, and he mostly chose against it. Calloway. Harlan. She sat but did not shake his hand. "How do you know I am in New York?" "I have someone in the Eastern District court system who flags filings of interest," he said. "Your attorney's preliminary motion hit the system 48 hours ago. Your name is on it." She noted the information without reacting. "What do you want?" He closed the book. Lorne Meridian's IPO would consolidate their position in the commercial real estate development corridor along the Hudson, territory I've been operating in for 6 years. If the IPO proceeds, Conrad restructures the equity, absorbs 3 properties where I have competing bids, and effectively locks me out of a market I have spent significant capital building. "So, you want to use my lawsuit to kill his IPO?" "I want to fund your lawsuit," he said. "All legal costs, Jasper Whitfield's fees, any expert witnesses, court costs, covered. In exchange for nothing, except that the lawsuit proceeds." Ren studied him. "All right, that is a generous offer with no stated return." "The return is the outcome," he said, picking up his coffee. "If Conrad loses the IPO timeline, his restructuring collapses. That is worth significantly more to me than your legal fees will cost. And if I win equity instead of a cash settlement, you get nothing, correct?" She looked at him for a long moment. "You are not a good man, Mr. Harlan. You are using my father's stolen contract to protect your market position." He did not flinch. "That is accurate. But you are not pretending otherwise," she said. "No." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I will use your money, but I make every decision. Strategy, timing, settlement terms, all are mine. You do not speak to my attorney without me present. You do not contact any party to this case. And you are a checkbook and nothing else." He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but close to it. "Agreed." She stood. "I will have Jasper send you the fee structure." She picked up her bag. "One more thing. You know Sloan Mercer? A slight tightening around his eyes, almost imperceptible. We have met. Nova tells me you two have a history. Nova is thorough, he said. Yes, she is. Ren looked at him steadily. If this is also personal for you, I need to know that now. Personal agendas have a way of complicating things at the worst possible moment. He looked out the window at the street for a moment. Then, it is personal. And it is business. Both can be true. Then keep them separated, she said. Or, I will end this arrangement immediately. She left. On the sidewalk, she texted Nova one word. Confirmed. Nova's response came back in 3 seconds. Buckle up. The Eastern District Federal Courthouse on Cadman Plaza in Brooklyn was the kind of building that made you feel the weight of what happened inside it before you even reached the steps. Ren arrived 11 minutes early. Dark blazer, structured tote, flat shoes. She dressed to be competent, not noticeable. Jasper was already inside, speaking with a clerk. She poured herself a water from a hallway fountain and reviewed the hearing brief on her phone. She was reading when she heard the doors open behind her. She knew before she turned. The way you know certain sounds even after years, a particular walk, the way a specific person's dress shoes hit marble. She turned because not turning would have felt like fear, and she had promised herself she was finished with that. Beckett Lorne stopped dead, 6 feet away. He wore charcoal gray, and he looked exactly like the man she had left in the penthouse, and also nothing like him. 3 years had done something to his face, not aged it, but sharpened it, carving out something underneath the control he had always worn. He looked, in that first unguarded second, like a man who had not slept well in a long time. His legal team stopped behind him. 4 people, all watching. Ren held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her phone. Ren. His voice landed differently than she had expected. Quieter. Like he was not sure he had the right to use her name. She looked up. Lorne, she said it pleasantly, professionally, like he was someone she had just been introduced to at a conference. I'm sorry. I just need to review something before we go inside. She walked to the hearing room. Behind her, she could hear his team murmuring that she was the plaintiff. But she heard nothing from Beckett himself. Inside, Jasper leaned close and whispered, "How are you doing?" "Fine," she answered. "You just walked past Beckett Lorne like he didn't even exist." "I did." "And you're fine?" She put her phone on the table and folded her hands. "I will be," she said. "Ask me again in about 43 days. The hearing lasted for 90 minutes. It was all procedural stuff. Motions, scheduling, and a short argument about jurisdiction that Jasper handled so smoothly, you could tell he'd been doing this for decades. Conrad Lorne's legal team objected to using the contract. So, Jasper pulled out a certified copy of the original notarized agreement. The entire room went silent. Ren didn't even glance at Beckett when the document was presented. Her eyes were locked on Conrad Lorne, who was sitting in the second row. He was 65 years old and powerful, the kind of man who'd spent his whole life avoiding consequences. When he saw the contract, something shifted in his expression. It was fear, plain and simple. In that moment, Ren understood. He always knew this day could come. He just gambled that James Calloway's family would never be organized enough, rich enough, or angry enough to fight him. He had miscalculated on all 3 points. That evening, Beckett confronted his father at the Lorne family home on East 71st Street. It was the house where he grew up, where Conrad still had his main office on the first floor. The staircase was lined with portraits of men in suits, like a warning of what you were expected to become. "Tell me the Calloway contract," Beckett said. Conrad was sitting at his desk, his jacket off and glasses on, looking over the very documents he'd likely been studying all afternoon. He didn't seem surprised. He'd had hours to practice his expression. "There was a problem with the original wording," Conrad said. "The language about royalties was vague. Legal looked at it in 2017 and told us it was not enforceable. That is not what the lawsuit claims. The lawsuit is a tactic from a woman who just wants from that woman's father designed the building on 6th Avenue, Beckett said flatly. Our flagship building. The one that made this company. Conrad took off his glasses. James Calloway was paid for his work. The design fee, yes, but not the royalty clause. The royalty clause was, I read the contract, Dad. He hadn't, not yet. But the way he said it made Conrad stop. I need to know the truth, not the version your lawyers came up with. Conrad looked at his son for a long moment, then carefully told a version of the truth, perfectly crafted like he'd done his whole life. Yes, he admitted, there was a clause. Yes, it was allowed to expire. Yes, Calloway had complained, but he was managed, and eventually he gave up. I made a business decision, Conrad explained. That's what you do. You protect the company. Beckett just stared at him. And so he died thinking he was a failure. People make their own choices. He designed your greatest building, and you buried his contract and let him believe he had failed. Conrad stood up. I built this entire company for you. Everything in this room, everything with your name on it, I built. And I protected it. That is what fathers are supposed to do. Beckett didn't reply. He just picked up his jacket from the chair. I am putting together a full legal response to the lawsuit, he said. We will fight them on the contract's timeline. He left without another word. For 11 minutes, he just sat in the back of his Mercedes in the dark outside his father's house. Then he called his head of legal and instructed them to build their defense. He told himself he still believed his father. Because if he didn't, everything he thought he knew about his own life would fall apart. That night, alone in his penthouse that felt all wrong quiet in the way a room is when someone is missing, he took out his phone. For the first time in 2 years, he searched for Wren's name. Calloway Studio, Los Angeles, award-winning and growing. He looked at her picture on the company website for a very long time. Then he placed his phone face down on the marble countertop. He had a counter motion to file. He had an IPO to protect. He had a company built on his father's choices, his own ambition, and things he was just now starting to question. He went to bed at 1 a.m. and slept horribly. If he was honest, he hadn't slept well in 3 years. But he wasn't always honest with himself, and he was only just starting to realize that. The ruling came down at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Jasper read it first. He stood in the courthouse hall with the paper in his hands, and Wren watched his face try hard to remain completely neutral. She'd seen that same look on clients right before she had to give them bad news about a budget. Tell me, she said. The judge ruled the royalty clause is admissible evidence, Jasper said carefully. However, he paused, the notarization has a technical problem. The signature of the second witness, the one who confirmed James's signature for the notary, that person's identity can't be verified. Without a living witness or an official secondary record, the notarization is invalid under New York state law. And without a valid notarization, the contract cannot be used as a legally binding document. We can still argue the case, but we have to start over with different evidence. He folded the document. The judge hasn't dismissed the case, but we just lost our most important piece of evidence. Nova, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, turned and walked to a window. She pressed her hand flat against the glass without a word. Wren stood completely still. She did the math in her head. Her 47 days had just shrunk to 31. Without the notarized contract to anchor their case, they would need to rebuild it, using other documents, emails, financial records, old letters. It was possible, but it would be much, much harder. Who was the second witness, she asked. Jasper hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. Jasper, the second witness was listed as P. He said. Petra Lauren, Conrad's wife. Wren just stared at him. You knew this. I knew her name was on the document. I didn't know if she was still alive or findable. I should have investigated more. That is my mistake, and I am sorry. Wren looked at the ceiling and took a deep breath. Where is she now? She's been out of the public eye for 2 years. There were some reports about her health. I'd need to find her, Wren interrupted. Today. She walked to the courthouse exit alone, pushed through the heavy doors into the cold November air, and stood on the steps looking out at the Brooklyn skyline. Gray sky, gray water, and the city just kept going, completely indifferent to her personal crisis. She pulled out her phone and called Theo's babysitter. Theo was fine. He'd eaten all of his lunch. He had built a fort out of pillows. He was doing just fine. She hung up and stood there for another minute. Then she forced herself to remember why she was really here. It wasn't for the money. It wasn't even entirely for her father, though he certainly deserved it. She was here because somewhere in a Manhattan penthouse, another contract had been buried, the one for a 3-year-old girl. The unspoken promise between a child and the father who didn't know she existed. And time was running out on that contract too. She walked to the subway, took out her Kindle, and opened to a page she had bookmarked in Meditations. It was a line she had been rereading for 3 years. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. She read it 3 times. The train arrived. She got on board. She was not giving up. Petra Lauren had picked Bryant Park for their meeting because she liked to watch the people. Wren understood that. She knew what it was like to want to be surrounded by movement when your own life felt frozen. Petra was already seated when Wren got there, wrapped in a camel-colored coat, a cup of tea on the small iron table in front of her. She was 60 years old, with silver hair and a delicate face that was no longer striking, but precise. She looked like a woman who had spent a lifetime perfecting her composure, and frankly, she looked tired of it. "Thank you for coming," Wren said as she sat down. "Thank you," Petra replied, "for not bringing anyone else." Petra's hands were wrapped around her teacup. Her left hand trembled just slightly. Wren realized it wasn't nerves. It was something else. "I was diagnosed 14 months ago," Petra said, following Wren's gaze. "Stage 2. We're managing it. I'm sorry. Don't be." It made things much clearer. She looked out at the park, at the crowds passing by with their coffee and their own ordinary problems. I was the second witness. When James signed that contract, I was in the room. Conrad asked me to come. He told me it was just a formality. So I signed it. I didn't read it closely. I trusted that Conrad knew what he was doing. She paused. I have trusted Conrad for 37 years. Most of that time, it cost me very little. This year, the price has become very clear. Wren's voice was steady. "Would you provide a sworn affidavit confirming you were the second witness?" "Yes," she said, without a pause. "My lawyer prepared one 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right person to ask." Wren stared at her. "You've been waiting? I watched the news, Ms. Calloway. When I saw you file the lawsuit, I knew you were coming." She reached into her bag, pulled out a sealed legal envelope, and slid it across the table. "I need you to understand something, though. I'm not doing this for your case, or for myself, or even for the right reasons. I'm doing it because—" She stopped, her jaw tightening. "Because I knew your father. I met him once at the contract signing. He was kind. He was so proud of his work. And I watched Conrad take that from him, and I did nothing. And then he died. And I've been doing nothing ever since." She looked right at Wren. "You deserved better. Your father deserved better. That is the only thing I am certain of." Wren held the envelope, saying nothing. "There's one more thing," Petra said, her voice low. "Conrad and Sloan set up that whole scene you saw that night. The phone call. Beckett was on a real work call with Sloan. She timed it to look intimate. When Conrad knew you'd be home. They needed you gone. The world went quiet. Beckett didn't know," she whispered. "He knew nothing. Conrad told him you'd left because you were unhappy, that you'd found someone else." Petra's eyes were steady. "He believed it because he already felt guilty. Guilty of working too much, of not really seeing you. Guilt makes people believe things they shouldn't." Wren looked at the envelope in her hands. "He looked for you," Petra said quietly. "For almost a year." Conrad told him to stop. Said it wasn't dignified. So eventually, she trailed off. He eventually stopped. But he looked. Wren stood up. She tucked the envelope carefully into her tote. "Thank you, Mrs. Lauren." Petra, she pulled on her coat. "I hope your treatment goes well." She walked away through Bryant Park and vanished into the crowd. Her face was completely calm. Her hands were completely steady. She would not let herself feel what Petra had just told her. Not yet. Not here. And not in the middle of everything. There were 29 days left. She had the affidavit. She had work to do. She would feel everything else later. She always did. Nova found the email chain at 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday, hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table. 3 empty coffee cups stood beside her, and she had the focused look she gets when she's about to crack something. "Ren," she said. "Come here." Ren came. The email chain was from 3 years ago. It was from an internal Lauren Meridian server, which Nova accessed through a security hole she wouldn't explain. 12 messages. Between Conrad Lauren and Sloan Mercer, beginning 8 days before the night Ren had walked out. She read them in order. The first 5 were business, the IPO timeline, the restructuring plan, the Callaway contract risk assessment. Then message 6 from Conrad. "We need her out of the picture before she finds the Callaway files. Beck won't act. We have to handle it ourselves." Message 7 from Sloan. "I know exactly how to do it. Trust me." Then came message 12. Sent the night of the dinner. Done. She's gone. Ren stood at the kitchen table and read the chain of emails twice. Then she set the laptop down and walked to the bedroom doorway. Theo was asleep. She listened to him breathing for a moment, then came back and sat down. "He didn't know," she said. "No," Nova said. "They told him I left because I was unhappy. She stopped." He believed them. He was already guilty, Nova said. Petra was right. Guilt is a door people leave unlocked. She paused. "It doesn't make him innocent, Ren." And he still stopped looking. He still chose to believe it. "I know. You still deserve everything you're fighting for. I know that too." Ren leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Sloan knew Beckett was going to come after her eventually, didn't she? That's why she got close to Conrad first. For protection. If the IPO succeeds, Conrad covers her. If it fails, she still has whatever she's managed to steal. Nova pulled up another file. "I found a secondary account. She's been quietly selling off Lauren Meridian's smaller assets for 14 months, just below the reporting threshold. It all adds up to about $4 million. Ren looked at her sister. "She's been robbing them." "She's been robbing him," Nova said. "Conrad's the one who trusted her. Beckett's name is on the company, but Conrad has been the actual operator." Ren was quiet for a moment. "Send the subsidiary information to Jasper. He needs to know for the hearing." She paused. "And send an anonymous tip to the SEC. Just the numbers. No name attached. Let them find her themselves." Nova started typing. "And Beckett?" Ren looked at the email chain still open on the screen. Conrad's words, "She's gone. Done. He gets to find out the same way I found out," she said. "By seeing the evidence in front of him and having to decide whether to believe it." She closed the laptop. "We have 22 days. I want to be ready for everything." She went to bed at midnight. Lying in the dark, she thought about a man who'd looked for her for a year and then stopped. She thought about what it felt like to be the one who'd been looking for justice for 3 years and hadn't stopped. She thought about Theo, who deserved a father, and about herself, who deserved answers, and her father's name on a contract that had been worth nothing until now. She turned over, closed her eyes, and slept. She had stopped waiting for things to be fair. She had started making them fair herself. That was the only version of this she could live with. The press conference was held at Beckett Lauren's office in Midtown. It was a sleek conference room on the 28th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing south. Manhattan was spread out below like a map. Ren had picked the timing 10 a.m. on a Thursday, 30 minutes before the New York Stock Exchange opened. She wore a charcoal blazer and her hair pulled back. She carried the certified copies of the contract, Petra's affidavit, and a single-page summary she'd written herself at midnight on the 4th draft. She stood at the front of the room, facing 12 financial journalists, 2 wire services, and a camera from CNBC. Jasper stood to her left. Nova stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the door. Wren spoke clearly and without drama. She laid out the contract. Her father's design work. The royalty clause. The 8 years of no payments. She presented the legal filing. She presented Petra's affidavit, noting it was given voluntarily and without pressure. She presented the subsidiary liquidation numbers Nova found, noting the SEC had been tipped off and was investigating. She answered 4 questions. She never raised her voice. She did not mention Beckett's name. At 10:22 a.m., she thanked the room and stepped away. At 10:31 a.m., Lauren Meridian pre-market shares fell 11%. At 10:47 a.m., Conrad Lauren appeared in the back of the room. Security hadn't stopped him because no one thought he would come himself, which told Wren all she needed to know about how badly they'd been blindsided. He was controlled, but just barely. "This is a fabrication," he told the room. "This is a disgruntled family using a decades-old document to interfere, Mr. Lauren," Jasper said calmly. "Petra Lauren's affidavit is notarized, witnessed, and filed with the court as of this morning. The contract is legally authenticated. I'd encourage you to speak with your counsel." Conrad looked at Wren. For the first time, she looked right back at him. Not with anger, but something quieter and more final. Recognition. She saw him for exactly what he was. "My father built your flagship tower." She said it quietly. Not for the cameras. Just to him. He died believing he was a failure. "Ethan, I'd like you to carry that." She picked up her bag. "We're done here." She walked to the elevator. Nova fell into step beside her. As the doors opened, Wren glanced back once and saw him, at the edge of the room by the window. Beckett Lauren. She hadn't known he was there. He was standing completely still, watching her. His legal team was talking to him, but he wasn't listening to them. She held his gaze for 1 second. 2. Then the elevator doors closed. In the lobby, Nova breathed out. "How do you feel?" Wren thought about it honestly. "Like I just set something down that was very heavy," she said. "Good heavy or bad heavy? Just heavy." She pushed through the revolving door onto the street. Cold air hit her face. "Get Jasper on the phone. I want to review the settlement parameters before the end of the day." She was already 3 steps ahead. She always had been. She was just finally in a position where it showed. Beckett didn't go back to the office after the press conference. He walked. He did something he almost never did anymore. He left his phone in his jacket and just walked. South through Midtown. Past the Empire State Building without looking up. East toward the river. The city moved around him with its usual indifferent speed. He walked until his legs told him to stop, which took about 45 minutes. He sat on a bench near the East River. It was cold. He didn't really care. He thought about the press conference. He thought about the contract. The real one. The original dot model. He thought about James Calloway, the name on blueprints from his childhood. The architect who designed the building his father always said made them who they were. Then he thought of Wren and how she looked on that stage. Her 6 words to his father had changed everything in that room for good. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "I need everything. All emails, files, any message between Conrad Thorne and Sloan Mercer for the last 4 years. Send it to my personal email, not the server. And tell no one." His next call was to Sloan. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, like it was just another day. He made a mental note of that. "We need to meet," he said. "Of course. Where are you?" "My office." 1 hour. He was back in 30 minutes, reading the files before she even arrived. He found it in the 7th email. He read it twice. Then he saw message 12, done. She's gone. He put his phone down, placed his hands flat on the desk, and took a breath. When Sloan walked in, she wore a mask of professional concern, like an actress ready with 3 different scripts. She took a seat across from him. He offered no coffee. He simply turned his laptop screen toward her and waited. He watched her read it, saw the gears turning in her mind, what to deny, where to draw the line, how to escape. Beckett, don't. He spoke so softly she froze. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm asking you to understand that these have already been sent to my lawyers and to the SEC. I flagged the subsidiary withdrawals myself. He paused. That is the only conversation we are having. She stood up, her composure perfect. He had to hand it to her. But her hands gave her away. He had an eye for details like that. She left without a word. Alone in his office, he thought about Wren leaving their penthouse 3 years ago. He'd told himself it was just another rough patch in a marriage full of them. He thought about the year he spent searching for her. He had really looked for her, not just gone through the motions his father wanted. He remembered stopping only because his father said Wren had moved on, that the kindest thing was to let her go. He replayed the fact that he had believed it. He made one more call. Not to his legal team. He called a therapist his doctor had recommended for 2 years and made an appointment for the next morning. Then, in his quiet office, he finally let himself feel it. He had made terrible errors and would have to live with that. It wasn't comfortable, but he sat with the feeling anyway. The emergency board meeting was set for 9 a.m. on Friday, called by Conrad himself. Jasper immediately saw that as a red flag. Men like Conrad Thorne only call these meetings when they think they have the winning hand. He was wrong about the cards. He just didn't realize it yet. Wren wasn't there. She was 2 floors down in a conference room with Nova and Jasper, watching a live feed from one of the board members. Theo was safe with the babysitter. It was 9 a.m., and after 5 hours of sleep, Wren felt perfectly clear. The board had 11 members. Conrad spent 20 years building his majority. But 2 members had been following the SEC inquiry overnight. 2 others had seen the real subsidiary numbers. And Beckett had personally called 4 board members the night before. Wren knew this because Jasper had been legally tracking their phones for a week. The meeting began and Conrad moved fast. He motioned to table all external claims against Thorne Meridian pending an internal review. At the same time, he moved to remove Beckett as CEO, pending a conduct review. The first motion failed 5-6. Conrad's expression didn't change. He moved on to the second. It failed 4-7. Beckett had locked in his votes before 8 a.m. Conrad had underestimated his son for the last time. He stood pointing at Beckett, his voice tight with anger. You're throwing away everything I built for you, and everything I protected. His voice was steady, a stillness Wren would have recognized. She used to think it was coldness, but now she knew it was a decision made and settled. You ruined a man's career over a contract clause, Beckett said. You let him die, believing he was a failure. You made my wife leave based on a lie. He paused. And you told me to stop looking for her. Another long pause. I'm done letting you decide what's worth protecting. By 10:15 a.m., Conrad was escorted out of the building. At 11:30 a.m., the SEC announced a formal investigation into Sloan Mercer for securities fraud. Her accounts were frozen. Her system access was revoked. Downstairs, Jasper closed his laptop. Inova leaned back and covered her face with her hands, letting out a long breath of relief. Wren sat with her hands folded on the table. She had watched the feed until the vote was official, and then she turned it off. She didn't need to watch Conrad leave or see the dominoes fall. Knowing it was happening was enough for her. The settlement proposal, she said. Is Beckett's team ready? Jasper nodded. They called this morning, before the meeting. He paused. He did, Wren. Not his lawyers, him personally. She took that in, her face unreadable. Schedule it for Monday, she said. I want the weekend. She texted the babysitter, home by noon. Can you stay for lunch? Then she put her phone away, stood up, and said, let's go get Theo. For the first time in 31 days, she said something that wasn't about the case. It felt like opening a window in a stuffy room. The meeting was in a neutral law office at Rockefeller Center that Monday morning. Wren made sure to arrive first and was already seated when Beckett came in. She had wondered how it would feel, sitting across a table from him with lawyers and a real purpose, with all the buried secrets finally out in the open. It felt, she realized, like standing in a house she had designed but never lived in. Beckett sat across from her, his lawyers taking their places. He looked at Wren like a man who'd rehearsed a speech, but at the last second decided to throw it away. "Before we start," he said, just to her, "I want to say something off the record." His lawyer touched his arm, but he gently brushed it away. "I believed the wrong story," he said. "I'd failed enough in our marriage that when my father offered an easy explanation, I accepted it. That is not an excuse. It's just what happened. I searched for you for almost a year, and then I gave up. I've thought about that moment every single day since." He paused. "I didn't know about the contract, or your father. There are not words for how sorry I am." Wren looked right at him. "I know you didn't know," she said. "I've known for 2 weeks." His expression changed. "But that doesn't change the cost," she said. "My father's name. 3 years. Theo growing up without—" She stopped herself. "It doesn't change the cost." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." The negotiation took 4 hours. Lorraine Meridian would pay the full royalty compounded over 8 years in cash. $47 million would be paid to the James A. Callaway Trust. Wren would create a design fellowship in her father's name at the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture, his old school. Callaway Studio would also get a formal, public acknowledgement of her father's design work on the flagship building. That included a permanent plaque on the building. Wren signed the papers at 2:15 p.m. As people filed out, Beckett remained seated. Wren packed her documents, aware he was still there. She let the silence sit. "I want to meet him," Beckett said softly. "When you're ready. When it's right for him. I'm just asking for a chance to be there." Wren straightened up and looked at him. He met her gaze with a new kind of honesty, completely unguarded. It was something she hadn't seen even when they were happy. "I will talk to my lawyer about making arrangements," she said. "Formal ones. He needs structure, not confusion. Whatever you decide." She grabbed her bag and walked to the door, but then she stopped and turned. "There's a therapist," she said. "Dr. Reed, 68th and Lex. She's good. She helped me realize you can't force someone to show up. Learning to show up for yourself has to come first." She set a business card on the table and didn't even look at his face. Then, she walked out into the Rockefeller Center corridor, past the Christmas decorations that were already going up weeks too early. She took the elevator down to the street, where the cold November air was waiting for her. Nova was outside, leaning on a wall and eating a granola bar. "Done?" Nova asked. "Done," Wren said. Nova handed her half of the granola bar, and they started walking toward the subway together. Wren never once looked back at the building. The city just kept buzzing around them at its normal pace, and that was just right. It was exactly what she wanted. She knew Dex Harlan would come to collect, but she never expected him to show up at Nova's door instead of hers. Nova was in the kitchen of their Midtown sublet, packing up the last of their things. They were moving out by the end of the week, both of them heading home. Wren was going to L.A. to expand Callaway Studio to New York. Nova was going back to Brooklyn and to whatever came next. The apartment was filled with boxes, tape, and that sad feeling of leaving a temporary place that had become important. Dex knocked at 7 p.m. Nova opened the door. "She's not here," Nova said. "I know," he replied. "I was actually hoping to talk to you." Nova studied him for a second, then stepped back. 2 minutes. He came inside, his eyes taking in the boxes, looking at how they had made the small apartment a home. There were books. A child's drawings were taped to the kitchen wall. A Kindle sat on the counter beside 2 coffee mugs. It was all proof of a life being rebuilt in a temporary place. "The IPO restructuring is going ahead without the clause we disputed," he said. "The Callaway settlement is separate. My interests are secure." "Great," Nova said. "You got what you wanted." "I did." He paused. "I also brought something real to the table. The funding meant Ren could move as quickly as she needed to. Without it, the timing might have been off. She would have figured it out, Nova said sharply. She always does. Dex was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the child's drawings on the wall. They were lopsided crayon buildings, drawn with heart. How old is he? 3.5. Does he know what his mother did? He knows she fixed something that was broken, Nova said. That's enough for now. He nodded, then looked directly at Nova. Sloan and I were together for 2 years, about 6 years ago, and I didn't know what she was. Not completely. I thought I did. I thought I understood her. I was wrong. He trailed off. She's very good at letting people see what they want to see. Nova crossed her arms. And you're telling me this because? Because you investigated me, and you're still looking at me like I owe an explanation, he said. I wanted to give you one. Nova considered him. You are not a good man, Dex. No, you used a dead man's contract issue just to get ahead. Yes, but you kept your word. You didn't get in the way, and you didn't make it worse. She tilted her head. That's about all I can say for you. He almost smiled. That might be the most accurate review I have ever received. Don't push it. She opened the door. Send the final invoice to Jasper. We will review it. She paused. And for what it's worth, Sloan chose to be what she is. That is on her. You were just wrong about her. Being wrong doesn't make you responsible for what she did. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Thank you. Don't thank me. It wasn't a compliment. She closed the door. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, then picked up her phone and called Ren. Dex came by, she said. No. I saw him leave the building from across the street. You were watching? I wanted to make sure he left without any issues. Nova laughed, a short, warm sound. He did. He's not dangerous, Ren. He's just strategic. Most dangerous people are just strategic, Ren said. But yes, I know. There was a comfortable pause, the kind of only sisters understand. We're going home, Nova said. Yeah, Ren said. We're going home. Outside the kitchen window, the city did what it always did. It kept moving, indifferent, enormous. It carried everyone's problems along without ever slowing down. Nova made some tea and finished her packing. She taped the last box shut with the special satisfaction of knowing a job was truly done. Ren chose Central Park for the meeting because it was neutral ground and because Theo loved especially the area near the conservatory garden with the fountain and wide path. It had enough open space for a 3.5-year-old to move at his preferred speed, which was always full throttle. She'd told Theo the week before, carefully and simply. She had said, "There's someone who wants to meet you. His name is Beckett. He's your father." Theo had thought about this for a very long time. He had a certain serious way of taking in new information. It reminded her of her own father, which made her throat tight in a way she was still learning to handle. Then Theo had asked, "Does he know how to build things?" "I'm not sure," Ren had said honestly. "You can ask him." It was a Saturday in late November. The air was cold, but the sun was out. The park was doing its best to look peaceful. Ren sat on a bench 20 feet from the fountain. Theo stood at the edge of the path, watching the water. He'd insisted on wearing his red rain boots, even though it wasn't raining, and she didn't argue. Beckett arrived exactly on time. He was dressed carefully, but not formally. Just carefully, the way you dress when you know something is important. A dark coat, no tie. He looked at Ren first, and she gave him the smallest nod. He walked toward Theo, stopped a few feet away, and crouched down to be at eye level with the child who was already studying him like a fascinating science experiment. "Hi," Beckett said. "Hi," Theo replied. Beckett looked at the fountain. "That's a good fountain." "It's okay," Theo said fairly. "The one in Griffith Park is better. It has more water." "I've never been to Griffith Park." Theo processed this new information. "It's in California, I know. I've never been." "You should go," Theo said. "It's good." He looked at Beckett with a directness that Ren knew was all him. "My mama said you're my dad." "Yes," Beckett said, his voice perfectly even. "I am." "Then how come I never saw you before?" A silence hung in the air. On the bench, Ren sat perfectly still. Because I didn't know where to find you, Beckett said. That was something that happened because of mistakes adults made, not you. It was never you. Theo thought about this. Okay, he said finally, in a tone that filed the information away for later. Then, can you build things? Something complicated and fast moved across Beckett's face. I'm better at business, but I can learn. Mama's good at building things, Theo said, clearly impressed. She built our whole apartment. Well, she designed it. Other people built it, but she told them how. I know, Beckett said quietly. She's very good at that. Theo reached into his coat pocket and took out 2 small wooden blocks. He carried them everywhere, like some kids carry a toy car. He held one out to Beckett. You can have this one, he said. We can build something. Beckett took the block. Then he sat right down on the cold path, cross-legged, ruining his coat without seeming to notice. Theo sat beside him. They began, with great seriousness, to build a little something with 2 blocks and a stick Theo found nearby. On the bench, Wren watched. The sun was thin in the November cold, and the park moved around them with its usual lovely indifference. She thought of her father, of his hands-on blueprints, of the things people build and the things that are taken away. And the things that, if you refuse to give up, eventually come back. Not the same. Never exactly the same, but they come back. She looked at Theo, handing Beckett another stick like a lead architect talking to a promising new employee. She looked at Beckett accepting it, like it was the most important job he'd ever received. She looked away, toward the fountain, and then up at the sky. She let herself feel it all, the grief, the warmth, the years, this very morning, without flinching. This was the work. To feel things completely and to stay. The city went on. The fountain ran. Her son built something from almost nothing with his father in the cold light of a Saturday he would not remember, but she would never, ever forget. That was enough. It was more than enough. In fact, it was everything. 6 months later, Conrad Lorne was convicted on 2 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of contract interference. The sentence was 3 years in a federal minimum security prison. His lawyers were already filing appeals that everyone knew would take years and ultimately go nowhere. He attended the sentencing in a gray suit, surrounded by his team, and said nothing to anyone. Petra was not there. She was in Connecticut, finishing her 2nd round of treatment. Her prognosis, Wren heard through Jasper, had improved a lot. Sloan Mercer pleaded guilty to securities fraud and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors for a shorter sentence. She lost her financial licenses permanently. She moved to a smaller city and, as far as anyone could tell, kept a very low profile. Wren thought about her sometimes and found that she felt mostly nothing, which she realized was its own kind of peace. The James A. Callaway Fellowship was announced at the University of Pennsylvania that April. A full scholarship for new architects from low-income families, with 3 winners each year. The first class was picked in June. Wren went to Philadelphia for the awards dinner. Her mother sat in the front row and cried, just like she always did at big events for 30 years, and it was one of the things Wren loved most about her. Callaway Studios opened its New York office in a converted loft in Tribeca. It was filled with light, an open floor plan, and had a small framed blueprint on the wall by the door. It was her father's original design sketch for the Lorne Meridian flagship. Just the drawing, with his handwriting in the margins. The plaque outside, as the settlement demanded, read, Original design, James A. Callaway, architect. The morning they put it up, she stood right in front of it. She placed her hand on the cool bronze. She said nothing, but that silence said everything. Theo now spent every other weekend with Beckett in Manhattan. Their new arrangement was handled by their lawyers, a clear and fair system that took a lot of work from everyone to create. Beckett found a child therapist to help Theo adjust to the changes. And Wren realized he'd also found Dr. Reed for himself. 6 weeks after she left that card on the table, she got a short, careful text from a new number. I called her. She wrote back, thank you. Then she replied with a single thumbs up and saved his new number simply as B. It was a Saturday afternoon in May. Wren was in her new Tribeca office, looking over plans for a home in the West Village. The late afternoon sun streamed through the huge north-facing windows, casting long, golden, forgiving shadows. She had a Starbucks she hadn't touched and was listening to a client call on her phone, taking notes. She heard the knock on the door before she even looked up. Beckett was standing in the doorway. He had just walked in the main entrance, which was always unlocked on Saturdays. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, much better coffee than her cold Starbucks. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "You live on the Upper East Side," she replied. "I walked." She set her pen down and just looked at him. The man she had loved, lost, and fought. The man she had survived. She came out the other side different, stronger, and somehow still standing. He put one of the coffee cups on her desk. "I wanted to ask you something," he started. She waited. Then he said, "But not today. I'm not asking you today. I just wanted to let you know that I plan to ask eventually, when the time feels right, and when I feel like I've earned the right to." He paused for a moment. "I'm not the same person I was. I know that doesn't fix things. I'm just telling you which way I'm headed." Wren glanced at the coffee on her desk, then back at him. "I know," she said quietly. He just nodded. He didn't press her or ask for anything more. He turned to go. "Beckett." He stopped. "Theo told me," she said, "that you're learning how to build things." A quiet, real change came over his face. "I'm not very good at it yet." "He says you're getting better." He held her gaze for another second, and then he was gone. She heard his footsteps down the hall, the ding of the elevator, and then the city noise swallowed everything else. She picked up the coffee he left. It was still warm. She took a sip and got back to work. In the office she had built, in the city her father helped shape. Her name was on the door, and her son's drawings were on the wall, right where the golden light stayed as long as she needed. The building stood strong. The fellowship got bigger. Theo built his own things. Wren worked. The city kept moving. And every single morning, the man who once had everything was slowly learning a simple truth. The only things really worth having are the things money can't buy. He was learning. And she was watching. Neither of them was in a rush. That was their ending. And it was enough. Now that's where our story closes, my amazing friends. If you're still here with me, then I know something about this story really connected with you. Maybe it was Wren's quiet resilience when her world fell apart. Or maybe it was how she kept going, even when everything was against her. Or maybe, just maybe, you saw a part of your own story in hers. Because this is the real lesson, and I want you to take it with you. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. Wren didn't win because life suddenly became fair. She won because she refused to let injustice have the final say. She rebuilt her life quietly, patiently, powerfully. And she did it not out of hatred, but out of love. Love for her father's legacy, for her son's future, and for the woman she was becoming. The real lesson is that healing isn't a loud performance. It rarely announces itself. It looks like opening your laptop at midnight when you are tired and afraid and deciding to move forward just one more time. So, no matter where you are, if life has given you something unfair or painful, something that feels impossible to get past, think of Wren. And remember that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most powerful person there is. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps our channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. And for more content like this every week, subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss anything. And please, share this with someone who could use this message today, because sometimes the right story finds you at the perfect moment. Thank you for watching. We will see you in our next video. This story is a work of original fiction, created for your entertainment. All characters, including Wren Calloway, Rebecca Lorne, Nova Calloway, Conrad Lorne, Petra Lorne, Sloan Mercer, Dex Harlan, and Jasper Whitfield, are completely fictional. They do not represent any real people, living or dead. Any similarity to real people, events, groups, or places is entirely coincidental. The situations in this story, including legal or business matters, are completely made up for dramatic effect. This content is not meant to be taken as real legal advice, financial guidance, or factual reporting of any kind. Any names of places, brands, or organizations are used only to create atmosphere for the story. This does not mean we are partnered with or endorsed by them. This video is intended for mature viewers who enjoy emotional, character-focused dramas. Our goal is to provide meaningful stories that encourage reflection, empathy, and hope, not to misrepresent reality. Thank you for watching responsibly.